Okay, we are recording. Hello, everyone. This workshop is A War by Any Other Name. Our presenters this afternoon are Rich Whitney, Margaret Flowers, and Kevin Zeese. Please go to the GPUS convention website for extensive bios. But all three have been longtime peace activists, members of the Green Party, and I am so happy to be hosting this webinar because I know it's going to be very, very informative. So I'm going to, Rich Whitney is going to begin. Thank you, Rich.
All right, thank you. And thank you all for being here today. I'm going to, please bear with me for a moment. I'm about to share my screen here. And let me get to the first slide. There we go. Okay. So we decided to title this A War by Any Other Name, a little Shakespearean here, just as a rose would by any other name would smell as sweet, a war by any other name is just as deadly. And what are we talking about? We're talking about how the United States is engaged in many forms of warfare that are not typically recognized as being acts of war. I'd like to begin with posing a question to you. Is it too much to ask for a government that will stop murdering people? Now, obviously, this is a rhetorical question, but it's not as simple to answer as you might think. The way I look at it, it shouldn't be too much to ask for this, but in fact, in practice, it is too much to ask of the two corporate political parties that government at almost all levels in this country. The two parties that are wedded to murderous police state and mass incarceration policies here at home, and even more wedded to the even more murderous imperialistic policies with respect to the peoples of other nations. The corporate so-called news media in this country are at least paying a little attention to police murders and repression right now, but they rarely talk about the other. And yet, in fact, although it's out of sight, out of mind, as far as the so-called national conversation is concerned, the U.S. is at war now in a number of countries, even though the media rarely talk about it. We've been at war in Afghanistan for 18 plus years. We're still at war in Iraq. We're still occupying territory and at war in Syria. We're still bombing people in Libya. We're still attacking people in Somalia. We're indirectly still involved in the horrific war in Yemen. We had been periodically drone striking Pakistan, although not much in the last few years. And meanwhile, we're illegally trying to overthrow sovereign governments in numerous other countries, imposing illegal economic sanctions against at least 39 countries, and engaging in reckless military brinksmanship with Russia and China. That includes the coup in Ukraine that was engineered a few years ago, arming Poland, putting more arms in Ukraine, etc., and other acts of reckless brinksmanship. Now, it's important to bear in mind, and probably most of you on this call do recognize this, but it bears repeating. Just because the corporate media rarely report on wars doesn't mean that they aren't happening. And, you know, you use as an example, how many people in the general public even know that the U.S. is at war in Somalia? You just never hear about it on the so-called news. And yet, the people of Somalia now. Incidentally, I meant to do this earlier. Little trigger warning, I do have a few graphic slides because, frankly, we need to see a little bit about the horrors of war because we're not seeing it at the current time. Now, one of the reasons why the wars are less visible now, besides the corporate media role, is the fact that U.S. military deaths have gone way down. And this is part of what we mean by war by another name. If you look, I don't know if you can see my my mouse there, but Vietnam War, official military deaths due to combat were over 47,000. The original war in Afghanistan, 1800, so-called Operation Iraqi Freedom, with apologies to George Orwell, 3,481. But if you, after 2010, roughly, if you look at the totals, there have been, you know, what President Obama called, oh, we're not going to have boots on the ground. Well, he did kind of keep that promise with a lot of the interventions on his watch. But look at this. I mean, there haven't been many U.S. military deaths. There have been basically in all of these conflicts less than 150. This incidentally kind of exposes the falsehood regarding the so-called Russian bounty placed to kill on American servicemen and women in Afghanistan. That would get us into a whole nother topic maybe we can get into a little bit about. But, you know, if they were paying a bounty, boy, they sure weren't paying enough, because clearly it hasn't had any impact. I think there have been exactly 4 military deaths in Afghanistan in the current year. But if we look at the targets of these wars, the human cost is absolutely staggering. Just give a couple of examples here. Medea Benjamin and Nicholas J.S. Davies did a study a couple years ago where they calculated that 2.4 million Iraqis have been killed since the 2003 invasion, the illegal 2003 invasion and continued occupation of Iraq. Or Libya. Libya is just a complete disaster. Because of the utter chaos, we don't even know really how many people were killed in that, but at least 7,000 were killed in the initial US-NATO bombing in 2011. Many more have been killed by the ethnic cleansing that was going on by the US-backed rebels. And the US continues to launch drone or bombing strikes in Libya the last several years. It's basically, Libya is just a battleground with a number of other countries also involved in that to this day. So what we want to talk about in this workshop is that modern US imperialism has adapted its means and methods of engaging war. And some of the ways in which it has done this in order to reduce domestic resistance is the increased use of drone warfare and other aircraft-only assaults, use of surrogates, use of illegal economic sanctions, strategic deployment of military bases for coercive purposes, the use of the CIA, National Endowment for Democracy, and other NGOs to disrupt and destroy national political autonomy. And I'm going to talk about the first two, and Margaret and Kevin are going to talk about the rest. But the thing I want to emphasize here is that although none of these are really new except the use of drones, they received increased emphasis. The American ruling class, when it makes war, increasingly are relying on these other means so that they don't have as many US American servicemen and women coming home in body bags. So talk a little bit about aircraft-only assaults. This is the official Air Force statistics that you can look up at if you look up under air power, and I can share the link to this later. But this shows the number of bombs that have been dropped in Afghanistan over the years. And if you look over here in the top right, you can see the totals. It's currently updated to February of this year. And although there has been a little bit of diminishment during this so-called peace process, it's clearly still going on. Over 7,400 bombs or missiles dropped on that beleaguered country in 2019. If you look at the figures for Iraq and Syria, those have gone down dramatically. They went up during the first year of the Trump administration, but you've seen a continued diminishment of that, partly because I think Trump has tried a few times to get out of Syria. Remember, he's announced it at least 3 times, we're leaving Syria, but the national security state always pushes back. And I think the last time he actually literally said, well, we're there to protect the oil, which is just such a flagrantly, flagrant statement that, yeah, but we're just going to do it anyway. But meanwhile, the bombing still, it may have diminished, but it's still going on. on an almost daily basis in these countries. So that has certainly been one factor. Talking about the use of surrogates, well, one very powerful surrogate that I think, this is by way of illustration, there are many examples we could cite of this, is of course U.S. support to Saudi Arabia. And of course, although Trump has continued the policy, it's not unique to Trump. This was clearly going on in a big way during Barack Obama's administration, selling Saudi Arabia more than $115 billion in weapons. And that has enabled this horrific war to continue under Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So while members of Congress might pat themselves in the back for the resolution they passed a couple years ago saying, well, we're not funding the war in Yemen anymore. Well, if you give Saudi Arabia $115 billion in weapons and you give them, I think the Trump administration gave them another $10 billion in military aid, well, guess what? You don't need to directly fund the war. You're still funding it de facto because you're giving these billions and billions of dollars in weapons to Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other so-called U.S. allies in the region. It is absolutely remarkable to me that when a Washington Post reporter was supposedly murdered by Saudi agents in Turkey, well, then the corporate media got all up in arms about Saudi Arabia, and you started to hear a little bit of noise about, gee, maybe we shouldn't give them so much money. But the fact that they're conducting these horrific strikes, man, just murdering people, bombing schools, markets, and mosques, that's not cause to cut off aid, not to the American ruling class, not to the Democrats and Republicans. When we're talking about use of surrogates, obviously you have to talk about Israel, which basically functions as a mini-me national security state for the United States in the Middle East. Here we have breaking news from, I don't know, some people that created this website called Popular Resistance. I don't know anything about it. Just kidding, Margaret and Kevin. But this is an important article. We're not going to get into the weeds on this one, but it's well worth reading. It was just published there yesterday. And this is just the latest act of depredation by Israel in apparently engaging in some covert, well, not so covert, some strikes inside of Iran. So Israel is certainly another surrogate power that does U.S. bidding. And then when you talk about surrogates, you also want to talk about the use of mercenaries, private contractor armies, and things of that nature. I want to call attention to this article at the Gray Zone Project, grayzone.com, or thegrayzone.com, I think it is. And this is a really good article by Alan McLeod talking about, he actually refers to it as almost comical. It would be comical if it weren't so deadly in its intent. But this was like, almost a farcical repeat of the Bay of Pigs attack on Cuba. But the main takeaway here is that, the U.S. gives tens of millions of dollars to this pretend president Guaido, and then he turns around and pays and arranges and basically reaches a contract with this private army called Silver Corp that then goes in and tries to take over the government. And, talk about putting a bounty on people. They put a bounty on Nicolas Maduro and others in the administration and basically said, you have license to go in to Venezuela and just start killing anyone who you think is a supporter of the Venezuelan government, the sovereign elected Venezuelan government. So the utter hypocrisy of the ruling class talking about this mythical Russia paying this bounty when the United States is actually paying a surrogate to kill people in a sovereign nation of Venezuela is just mind-boggling. And it's just one illustration. Obviously, when you're talking about mercenaries, you also have the role of, they keep changing the name, but Z, it used to be called Blackwater, that was played a very major role in the occupation of Iraq and, caused a number of problems there. But yeah, war has been privatized to a large degree. And this is another way in which the United States has been able to minimize official U.S. casualties in order to get people in this country to not care as much about war, or to keep it invisible to the American people, but the wars do go on. So those are just two in which the United States is continuing to commit war by other means. I'm now going to turn it over to talk to you, Britt.
Hey, thank you so much for putting part of it. Who's participating? Comments that wisdom to keep using the. Start out by talking about sanctions, and sanctions in reality as a punishment. We commonly call sanctions in the United States are not actually sanctions at all. They never went through a process. It's just the United States deciding to take these actions against other countries. And so the technical term for what the United States is doing is called unilateral coercive economic measures. And they're actually not lawful, which I'll get into later on. They're not really designed to stop any sort of unlawful action. What they're designed to do is impose regime change, create a situation where the country is unstable, there's chaos, or there's mass death or starvation, we'll get into, and to its knees, or as we heard in Chile, the United States saying that they wanted to overthrow. Okay. United Nations likens these unilateral coercive measures to, he calls them a medieval siege of a town to force surrender. And that's what the United States is trying to do to other countries. So what are some types of sanctions? The United States can put out sanctions that stop banks from doing financial transactions with a country or providing credit to that country. They can freeze a country's assets. They can steal the assets. When it comes to Venezuela, the United States literally gave the Venezuelan oil company Citgo over to the coup supporters, Juan Guaido and his people. We're now in a situation where Venezuela has $1.2 billion worth of gold in the Bank of England, and they've asked for that so they can make a purchase through the United Nations for food and medicine. And the Bank of England is refusing to give that, and the court in England sided with that and said that Venezuela didn't have the right to its own gold. We also see, forbidding certain business transactions or blocking them. Again, Venezuela, a country that I'm very familiar with, earlier this spring, Venezuela bought 5 tankers worth of oil and supplies from Iran, and the United States, which has its largest deployment of U.S. military in the area around Venezuela and that we've seen in 30 years, threatened to blockade those tankers from reaching Venezuela. Fortunately, Iran didn't back down. Venezuelan military escorted those tankers through Venezuelan waters, and there was not an incident. But now with the next order, the United States actually got a court order saying that it has the right to forfeit the stuff that's on the Iranian tankers that will be coming in. There's also bans on trade and travel, and another thing that the United States does, which are called secondary sanctions, is we threaten corporations and countries from doing business and say that we will sanction you if you do business with such and such a country. So there's the impact of the sanctions. The biggest impact in some countries, if we look at Cuba, has been under blockade now since the Cuban Revolution. Same thing with Iran, ever since 1979, when the Iranians overthrew the US-backed Shah. The United States started imposing sanctions against them. Same thing with Zimbabwe, very long-term sanctions. Big impact is that they limit the country's ability to purchase necessities like food and medications and basic supplies, equipment, parts that they need to keep their infrastructure running. Now, the United States says, oh, our sanctions don't impact food and medicines and necessities like that. But the reality is they do, because countries and companies refuse to do business with sanctioned countries because they're afraid of what the United States might do to them in retaliation. In addition to that, just getting supplies to those countries is very difficult because you need certain insurances and things like that in order to ship products, and the insurance companies don't want to have anything to do with insuring, shipments that are going to sanctioned countries. It has a big impact on shutting down industry and agriculture. So when we were in Venezuela last year, they reported to us that they had previously been one of the biggest pharmaceutical manufacturers in Latin America. And because they weren't able to get the precursors to produce the medications, they had an 84% deficit of medications in Venezuela. They had public ads on TV saying, if you have some extra of this medicine, somebody needs it here, you can call them, trying to make sure that people could get what they need. It also weakens the infrastructure when things break down in the power structure or the water or transportation sectors. It makes it very hard for them to repair 2 elevators out of 6 that are running because they're keeping the other 4 for spare parts. Or there were electrical attacks in Venezuela against the infrastructure, and getting the parts to repair those is difficult. Same thing with the oil industry. And that was a big part of the Iranian tankers, is that Venezuelan, their refineries have not been able to run properly because they don't have the parts to keep them running. And the Iranian tankers were bringing those parts to get their oil running again. They also really limit the income of those countries. So in 2017, when President Trump imposed sanctions on Venezuela, not allowing them to get credit and things like that, it actually caused a $6 billion loss in their oil exports. The United States also, in the 2019, I think it was, executive order, stopped purchasing oil from Venezuela. We were one of the biggest purchasers of oil from them. So it has a real economic impact. North Korea has outlined this. Cuba has put out reports of the trillions of dollars they've lost over the years in income. And I mentioned that these are not legal. So the United Nations Charter basically says that in order for there to be a sanction imposed on a country, it has to go through the United Nations Security Council. There has to be that legal process. And so what the United States is doing through these unilateral coercive measures violates that United Nations Charter. But it also violates the Charter of the Organization of American States. It violates various covenants against civil and political rights. It violates the Vienna Convention. So it violates international law. The International Court of Justice of the United Nations is the court that hears these cases, and they actually ruled a few years ago that these sanctions impacting Iran, amounting to about $2 billion, were not legal, but unfortunately they don't have the enforcement mechanism to enforce that decision. But at least they made that decision. And because these coercive measures or economic war or economic terrorism are impacting the people, they're not impacting the political leaders that much, but they are causing deaths and hunger and difficulties for the actual population. This is considered to be collective punishment, and that is a crime against humanity. The Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. did a study last year just looking at Venezuela, and they found that the sanctions led to the deaths of 40,000 Venezuelans just in 2017 to 2018. So we're talking about tens of millions of people. Kevin and I traveled to Iran last year as well, talking to people there. Students who want to go to school outside of the country don't have a way to pay their tuition, so they can't do that. Patients who have serious illnesses like cancer can't get their medication. So this is really impacting the people. That's a crime against humanity. And Venezuela has filed a case against the United States in the International Criminal Court, saying our economic measures are crimes against humanity. So what countries are sanctioned? It's over 30 countries right now that the United States has imposed these unilateral measures on. It's about a third of the world population. Looking at kind of the Asian Pacific and West Asia, some of the countries are China, Afghanistan, Laos, Myanmar, North Korea, Sri Lanka, Kyrgyzstan, Fiji, Lebanon, Yemen, Iran, Iraq, Palestine, Syria, Belarus, Cyprus. Also in the European region, Belarus, Crimea, Russia is impacted. Many African countries, so Burundi, Central African Republic, Ivory Coast, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Eritrea, Liberia, Libya, Rwanda, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Zimbabwe, and then in the Latin America area, impacting Cuba, Venezuela, Haiti, and Nicaragua. So a lot of countries that are directly impacted. A third of the world's population is facing these economic warfare measures designed to hurt them. So a number of organizations in the United States came together last year. We created a coalition called Sanctions Kill. You can check out the website at sanctionskill.org. We help coordinate national and international days of action. We also do educational webinars. There's a number of webinars that you can see on the homepage that we did recently with political representatives, ambassadors and diplomats from the impacted countries, so we could hear directly from them what they're experiencing. We also, through Popular Resistance and the Embassy Protection Collective, have a webinar coming up this next Thursday involving 21 representatives of social movements in Venezuela, plus representatives of United States social movements, talking about US imperialism and its impacts and what we can do to build solidarity to stop that. I've also been asked to talk about military bases, and I only have about a minute or a couple minutes for that. So David Vine does really great work on this and has a book called Base Nation. But the United States has over 800 bases around the world. Compare that, and those are in 80 countries. Compare that to Russia, which has 10, China, which has 1 exterior base. The United States has 95% of the military bases around the world. And then if you consider our floating military bases, our naval aircraft carriers, we have 19 of those and plans to build more of those. We have a military presence in over 170 countries. Vijay Prashad estimates that it's 183 countries that we have a military presence in. If you look at African countries, we have a presence in, I think, 53 now of the 54 countries. And this has been something that really expanded under President Obama through AFRICOM. So we're spending about $156 billion a year to support the troops on these bases. It costs about $10,000 to $40,000 more a year per soldier to keep them on an overseas base. And this is a huge benefit for the military industrial complex, for them to, to reap a lot of profits. And it also, these bases are used as forms of aggression against other countries. So under Obama's Asian Pacific pivot, not only were we doing kind of trade or economic warfare against them, but we also pushed a lot of countries to allow us in or build more bases to surround China, to antagonize them. We've been doing the same thing through NATO countries to antagonize Russia. Iran has 35 US bases ringed around the country, just basically threatening it, but also sadly providing targets for Iran if the United States were to do something. There's a lot of opposition to bases in foreign countries, particularly looking at the struggle in Okinawa right now. Okinawa has the majority of Japan's US bases. The US is trying to relocate a new base in Futenma to a very environmentally sensitive zone. A lot of protests against that, a lot of protests in South Korea, previously against the base on Jeju Island, but also now in Gwangju against where they're trying to put in an anti-missile defense system there. So there's a lot of pushback in countries, and these bases do destroy environmentally sensitive areas. They displace peoples from their land, and they bring violence and sexual violence into those communities, as well as accidents when helicopters and planes crash in those communities located around these bases. So the United States is the largest empire in the history of the world. We're very overstretched, and our military, we have to say as Green Party members, is also the largest polluter and user of fossil fuels in the world. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Kevin. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks both Rich and Margaret, great presentations, and thank you all for being here. We're glad to see such a good turnout for this. It's so important that we be the peace party because we are really looking at the corporate duopoly of Democrats and Republicans as two arms of a big war party. I'm going to focus on covert operations and regime change. And really all of these issues we're discussing, that all three of us are discussing, are all part of what's called hybrid warfare, which is going at countries with multiple directions, multiple tools. These covert operations run by the CIA and as a black box, not always public, although sometimes it does become public, as we saw in Syria, through the National Endowment of Democracy, which is the funder of a lot of regime change operations, and through non-governmental organizations, both in the United States and that we fund in target. These are the kinds of tools that agencies that are involved in working to create divisiveness in countries, build movements against governments we don't like, and they work in conjunction with economic sanctions and often our preparation to weaken a country for military attack. This has been the way of war really for the United States since the founding of even before the founding of the country. In the wars against the indigenous people, we destroyed their homes, destroyed their food crops, killed civilians, non-warrior Indians. And so this is the US way of war. And we would do those kinds of economic attacks before often military attacks. So this has just continued throughout US history. Now, often people in the United States are confused about these regime change efforts because we are also targets in the United States of PSYOPs programs, psychological operations. The Pentagon is now allowed, as of a few years ago, to use their PR campaigns against US citizens. And so we often get people very confused, even in the peace movement. We saw that over Syria, lots of division in the peace movement. We see it over Venezuela, Nicaragua, Hong Kong, so much confusion in the United States because we are given misinformation. So I think one of the goals of this presentation, because Greens are really important in the peace movement, is for us to realize that we have a role to play to correct that misinformation. And so I hope I'll give you some tools for doing that. And so we want to be able to identify what's a real protest, what is the US inspired protest, what's a regime change effort that's legitimate, change in government that's legitimate. So we can help you all clear, I expect many of you, because that's how Green Party activists often are. The purpose of these regime change efforts is to create instability and division in a country that the government wants to replace. Governments that are targeted because they refuse to be part of US empire or have broken from US domination. Countries like Iran, which broke from US domination in 1979, Venezuela, which did so in 1998, 99, Cuba, which with Fidel Castro, Nicaragua, with Sandinistas, these all broke from US domination and the US is punishing them for it. They are trying to force them back under US control. With those countries, so far, it's not working. Or it could be a country like Ukraine, which is already mentioned, which has a democratically elected government, but it was leaning toward Russia. The US spent $5 billion. We know that because Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State under Hillary Clinton, said that publicly, that the US spent $5 billion to build opposition to the government in Ukraine and replace it with a coup d'etat, so that their goal is to make Ukraine part of NATO. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Or they can be a country that is a US target, like a portion of a country that's a US target. For example, China is the #1 target of US foreign policy. Our foreign policy is now officially great power conflict. We've gone from the war on terrorism to great power conflict that began under President Obama with the Asian pivot, but now it's been formed into a full policy by the Pentagon, and China is the #1 target of great power conflict. So whenever you see something reported about China, where it's the Uyghurs, the Muslims, or Hong Kong, or Taiwan, it's always important to question it. Look for various sources, because remember, we are targets of US PSYOPs. We are targets of misinformation. And Hong Kong was a really excellent example of Americans being fooled. So often people in the United States see people in the street and they say, wow, look at that, a revolt. But if you look into what's really going on in Hong Kong, you see them singing the Star Spangled Banner. You see their leaders coming to the United States and meeting with Marco Rubio and Michael Pence and Tom Cotton, anti-China politicians. When you see the money that NED is sending to China, to Hong Kong, and how they've been doing so since the late 1990s, since the transition from a UK colony to part of China. U.S. is spending millions of dollars to build opposition in China. So it's really important to, when you get news about China or Russia in particular, to doubt what you heard. The same, of course, is true with Venezuela and Iran. One of the things we found when we were in Venezuela and Iran was that often we're told the opposite of the truth. And so it's so important to look for various sources to get a fuller picture of what's really going on. So to understand these regime change efforts, I think there's three things we have to understand: the goals of the United States, with the strategy of the United States, and the tactics. If we understand the goals, strategies, and tactics, we can start to understand what's really going on. The first goal, of course, is geopolitical. The U.S. is the largest empire in world history. Margaret mentioned we have 800 bases. You know, the UK and Rome, when they were the largest empires in world history, had about 35 bases. We have 800 plus military outposts, totaling more than 1,200 military outposts and bases. So we are everywhere. And so that geopolitical goal is critical. And I think that's what Ukraine was about. Ukraine borders Russia, one of the top targets of the United States. So spending $5 billion to create an anti-government movement in Russia, even if it is tied to the fascist part of Ukraine, which has a very strong fascist history, that was worth it for the United States. They can bring NATO into Ukraine into NATO. That is another NATO military base, military operations on the border of Russia. It's very important. Another key example would be Syria and Iran. These are geopolitical targets because of the Middle East, because of oil. Syria, because of the Belt and Road Initiative that China is doing from China to Europe. Syria is a key part of that. So getting control of Syria is very important. And of course, they want to be able to show that a country that breaks from U.S. empire cannot be independent. They do not want, they will punish and prevent that country from surviving. Another factor in goals is basically imperialism. The country has resources the United States wants. Obviously, that's true with Iran. Venezuela. Venezuela is the #1 oil reserves in the world, but also #1 in gold and diamonds. #5 in gas. It has precious metals that are essential for electronics and for weapons. And they have a lot of natural water, which is going to become more and more a precious resource. So those are the kinds of things that drive them. And, you know, in the chat box, I saw comments, I think were really good points, about countries that try to break from U.S. financial control by creating their own currencies, or in Libya's case, by trying to create an African currency. That's another example of why the U.S. would target a country, because they don't want to lose that financial control, which is such a critical part of hybrid warfare. As to strategy, U.S. strategy is to create enough suffering so that it creates civil unrest. It's intolerable. The government's blamed for incompetence, and people push to change the government. It doesn't always work. In fact, it rarely works. Often it has the actual reverse effect. It rallies people around their government because they know that the U.S. is under attack. But that is the goal, is to create enough problems in the country so that there is a revolt against the government. And if those covert operations fail, then these are looked at as precursors to escalation. And that could be the mercenaries that Rich talked about, outright military attack. We had the so-called moderate rebels in Syria as an example of going from covert to overt. And it ends up with, if it's essential, the shock and awe type aerial campaign we saw in Iraq, followed by invasion and occupation. So that's the strategy. Tactics, they have a wide variety of tactics in the United States. And this has been going on for so long that we've been developing these tactics and refining them, getting better at them. And one, of course, is the obvious: creating protests or manipulating protests. And this is one of the challenges for people in the United States, because in all of these countries, like in our own country, there are people who have problems with the government. In Hong Kong, for example, they have a terrible neoliberal capitalist system that has one of the largest wealth divides in the country, terrible cost of housing, lousy jobs, no hope for most people, low pay, long hours. People have lots of good reasons to be upset with the government. The thing is, though, these protests, when you look at a manipulated protest, what you saw in Hong Kong was people holding signs saying, "Donald Trump, please save us." Or, you know, as I said, singing the Star Spangled Banner, or carrying the American U.S. flag or the UK flag, calling for UK colonialism, which was much worse for the people of Hong Kong than the current situation. And the issues of neoliberal capitalism are really not China's issue. The current situation in Hong Kong is, as after 1997, when the transition began, China is not allowed to change the economy or the government of Hong Kong until 50 years, 2047. And so the real target of these problems in Hong Kong is the neoliberal economy and the very corporate government of Hong Kong. It's not really China, but the U.S. has manipulated those protests so that they can claim it's a democracy movement, which is, they have so much more democracy now than they had under the UK, and in reality, it's not a democracy movement, it's a separatist movement. What the U.S. wants is by 2047 for Hong Kong to be independent, so the U.S. can keep its naval bases there, put a military base there, right on the border with China. That's what the U.S. really, the long-term goal is, a geopolitical goal against the #1 target, China. So we got to be very careful when we read about what's happening in China. What the U.S. also as a tactic is to fund local groups. NED puts a lot of money into creating human rights groups, democracy groups, so-called media groups. These are all very common groups that are funded by NED, so that if there's something happening in Nicaragua, you hear from a Nicaraguan human rights group, sounds like, oh, human rights are being violated in Nicaragua. But what you don't know is that's actually an NED-funded group putting out the U.S. line. So that confuses a lot of people in the United States, because in the media in the United States quotes that human rights group, that environmental group, that democracy group, that's NED funded, and it sounds like it's coming from that country. In reality, it's coming from U.S. funding. And a lot of these human rights groups will work with groups like Human Rights Watch. Now, Human Rights Watch is a organization that's funded by Wall Street, and is a door back and forth between, a revolving door back and forth between the U.S. State Department and Human Rights Watch. And they often put out reports that are very biased and support U.S. regime change operations. Another common tactic is social media campaigns. U.S. NED will actually bring activists from Venezuela, from Nicaragua, to the United States and train them on how to use social media. And so you see a lot of that, and often they get caught in lies, so it's a real battle for the narrative. And that's one of the things we'll talk about what we can do at the end, after we're done. We'll talk as what our next steps should be. We have to control that narrative as best we can. And you get corporate media campaigns. The New York Times and the Washington Post, as well as cable outlets, are well known for putting out false information that supports the regime change narrative. And so we have to doubt what we read in our own newspapers, have to look for various sources. That's why we created Popular Resistance. PopularResistance.org as a daily media reporting service. You can sign up for free. It's about 15 articles a day about what the movement's doing and issues around the movement. And so we are trying to work with others to balance that narrative and get the truth out. Another tactic is economic power, like the IMF. Not just sanctions, but IMF loaning money, getting a country in debt, and then structural readjustment, cuts to basic services. Neoliberalism is put in place that way. And then they'll go even as far as we see in Venezuela, with recognizing a fake government like Juan Guaido. And this is very serious. The reason why London denied the access to Venezuela's gold was the court said, Guaido is president. He is not asking for the gold. Maduro, you're not president. We had the same problem when we were prosecuted in federal court in Washington, D.C. for our work to protect the Venezuelan embassy in Georgetown. In that courtroom, the judge told the jury, Juan Guaido is president. So we had permission from the foreign minister and the government of Venezuela under President Maduro, but in that courtroom, Maduro was not president. So these recognizing an alternative government, putting that false narrative out, has implications not in many, many ways. Of course, sabotage is coming, cutting off electricity, cutting off water, cutting off other essentials. Terrorist activities are coming. Black sites for interrogation and torture have been U.S. black sites all over the world. Assassinations have been part of U.S. Tactics for years. Attacks on food supplies. When food gets scarce, that leads to revolt. And then a more recent tactic now is lawfare, using the judicial process, as we saw in Brazil with Lula da Silva being falsely prosecuted and kept out of an election, or with Dilma Rousseff being impeached in Brazil. That lawfare is a new tactic. And even the DEA is a problem, the Drug Enforcement Administration. It often goes into countries not about drugs, but about being a regime change agency. That's why Bolivia kicked them out. That's why Venezuela kicked them out, because they were involved in activities on regime change. And then, of course, you can have the coup, as we see in Bolivia. That's a very good example of the coup. And that is a violent coup. We'll see how that turns out. The upcoming election, the polls are showing that the MAS party will win the first round. But that, of course, we see how fair that election is. So key question is understanding what's going on. First, look at the map. to see if there's geopolitical issues involved, look at the countries involved to see if this fits in the great power conflict, or it fits into getting natural resources for transnational corporations if it plays to imperialism. So maps are the first thing to look at. The second thing to understand what's going on is follow the money. Check the National Endowment for Democracy's website. They actually publish what they're funding around the world in various countries. That's a great place to start, and you'll see incredible how much money we put into Hong Kong, Ukraine, Venezuela, Nicaragua. It's just NED creates movements in these countries to challenge the government we don't like. And the final thing you have to do, I think, with understanding what's going on is ask the question, who benefits? When you ask that question in Hong Kong, who benefits, the people aren't benefiting from the protests that don't deal with the issues of neoliberal democracy. The people aren't benefiting by separating from China, which actually provides Hong Kong with resources. And so asking who benefits, I think, is a very critical part of understanding what's really going on. I'll stop there and just say that thanks again for being here, and I hope that the Green Party can play a leadership role in combating this hybrid warfare that has become so common in US tactics. Thank you all very much.
Okay, at this time, we're going to move into just a brief panel discussion of what are some of the takeaways from this with myself, Margaret, and Kevin. And then we're going to go into Q&A. So I don't know which of the three of us, we don't have this over rehearsed, which of the three of us wants to go first. But I'd kind of like to start with sharing something. I want to make sure that we include this. I'm going to go back to share screen for just a moment, if you'll bear with me. There we go. Okay. Whoops, that's not it. Hold on. Oh, real quick, this map, we talked about, the U.S. empire. I think this map actually probably understates all the countries where the U.S. has a military presence. Probably almost all of Africa really should be colored purple there, or pink purple today. But this still gives you some illustration of what these bases in their totality look like. What I wanted to, my takeaway, and I'll try to do this very quickly, is that because the corporate media largely ignore or distort the crimes against peace, and that's what they are. These violate the Nuremberg Charter, right? These acts, these are crimes against peace that the U.S. is committing all over the world. It's very important for us in the Green Party to educate ourselves and help get the word out and educate others. There's no shortcuts for it because, we have these organizations that are fighting for peace. We have to make people aware of these and make people aware of the good fight that is being fought. So when people say, oh, there's no peace movement in the U.S., that's not true. It's just ignored by the corporate media as well. These are just some of the organizations that are struggling for peace, struggling to change U.S. foreign policy. This presentation is being recorded, so you can go back and copy these down later if you will. I also wanted to call attention to the Green Party Peace Action Committee, of which we are a member, and I see some other Green Party Peace Action Committee folks here. We have down at the lower right there, we have peace pledges. Anyone who's involved in a Green Party campaign, obviously the candidate, but if you're working on a campaign, make sure your candidates are aware of these peace pledges. We have them for President, U.S. House, U.S. Senate, and even state and local offices, because even though state and local office holders are limited in what they could do about foreign policy, there are still some concrete steps they can take. And if you go to these peace pledges, you can see, this is what we want our candidates to stand for, and there are links there to that are also informative and help educate. Along the same lines, shout out to the Black Alliance for Peace. They are doing some very good work, and they also have a candidate pledge that is similar, but it includes some other aspects that are not included in the Peace Action Pledge, including the ties between militarism and domestic police repression, which also obviously is something that Greens need to be shouting to the world about. So I wanted to recognize that and check that out. And then, because the corporate media aren't telling us the story, we have to get out. You know, we're dealing with a new McCarthyism in this country right now, with groups like the Atlantic Council and the German Marshall Fund and others being hired by Facebook and the social media platforms. They don't like people talking to each other horizontally and informing each other. There is repression. A lot of these sites that you see here have been deplatformed or otherwise been restricted by on Google searches and in other ways being repressed, so that when they share information, it's not disseminated as effectively. That means that we have to make sure that we go to these sites and help propagate them. It has to be, we have to try to fight the McCarthyism that we're dealing with. You know, these are some of the sources that actually, this is where real journalism is taking place, right, on some of these. And I'm sure Kevin and Margaret could cite some others, but, and I wanted to include and shout out to Popular Resistance and the great and tireless work that Kevin and Margaret have been doing over the years. That is one of the sources listed. It's great. They have a lot of information there. This is one of the ways in which we can overcome this, right? And try to challenge the ruling class narrative that we're being fed, and more importantly, what we're not being told. That's, you know, that's part of what is going on here. Also, just really quickly, for candidates, it's important to do opposition research. You want to find out what the Democratic or Republican incumbent has been up to, what they voted for, which is almost always going to be pro-war stuff. These are just a few places you can go to look at and find that information. So I guess that's my main takeaway. There's obviously a lot more to talk about, limited time, but the thing that I would like to stress is that because the corporate media do not cover these things except to distort or divide or confuse, it's very important that we go to the real journalists who are doing the real exposés, like Popular Resistance and some of the other ones that I'm sharing here. So with that, I'll turn it over to Margaret or Kevin for their takeaways.
I think I'll go next because Kevin is really good at wrapping up and mopping up everything I don't say. So thank you, Rich. I want to make a few points. I mean, one is that one of the reasons that I am active in anti-war and peace movements is that I believe that as a person who's a citizen of empire, I have a particular responsibility to do what I can to try to stop U.S. imperialism, to stop this U.S. aggression. And so I think that we as people in the United States really have that special responsibility to everyone else around the world to do what we can to change things. I also think that it's important to think about how what the United States does abroad impacts us directly. A country that is willing to attack recklessly and based on lies Black and brown people all over the world, of course, is going to attack Black and brown people. That's willing to limiting their access to food, medications, basic infrastructure. We see the same thing happening here with the reduction of support for food programs, with the failure, lack of having a universal healthcare system, with a for-profit pharma industry that makes medications out of reach. So all of these things, are if we allow our government to do them abroad, we can also expect that they're going to do them to us too. And I think that's an important way. Rich mentioned Black Alliance for Peace that does excellent work connecting militarism, at home and abroad. Veterans for Peace has been doing this as well. I think this is an important way for us to really help to build the movement against, U.S. empire. Another big area is climate. I mentioned the military is the biggest polluter and fossil fuel user. We really can't address the climate crisis without addressing the US military and defunding it and downsizing it. We don't want a green military. We need to stop the wars for oil, et cetera. And so there's been a lot of work done in recent years to make connections with the climate movement, between the anti-war movement and the climate movement. We did that last fall during the climate meetings at the UN in New York last September with Stop the Wars, Save the Planet. There's a lot of great tools out there now for that. One area we didn't talk about today is the Space Force. I think that's something people need to be aware of, and maybe in the future, something we can talk about as a Green Party. But I think what's really important is that right now, in this decade, and this has been predicted by analysts, Kevin and I at Popular Resistance have been talking about it for a few years, the United States is a falling empire. And I think the pandemic and our failure to respond to it are ramping up aggression worldwide while other countries are trying to collaborate. Our failure to address the recession and financially support our people, all of this is showing, the U.S. as a failed state to the world, and now countries are saying that they don't look to the U.S. for leadership anymore. And in fact, when Mike Pompeo was at the United Nations last week trying to, get other UN Security Council countries to support more sanctions on Iran, they basically all stood up to him and said, "Who are you to talk? You dropped out of the UN, the Iran peace agreement or the nuclear agreement." So other countries are actually starting to get the courage to stand up to the United States. I think we're going to see more of that in the future. And so our empire is falling. What is that fall going to look like? What is it going to result in? The RAND Corporation did a study this year looking at the future of warfare, and we have published an article about that in Popular Resistance. And this is consistent with other Pentagon reports, where basically the Pentagon's response to losing primacy in the world is more funding for military, more surveillance, more aggression. And the RAND report was important, I think, for the peace movement because it looked at some of the obstacles to that. And they cited right from the beginning, public sentiment against the wars was a big problem for them, they felt, in terms of getting funding and the permission to wage the actions that they want to wage. So we need to remember that we actually do have power. Another big one was social media and the fact that people around the world through their phones and other alternative platforms are able to document and show what's happening and tell the stories of what's happening, that they've lost control of the narrative is how they see it. And so I think that's an important point for us to understand the importance of us to get that narrative out there. Somebody mentioned, what about letters to the editor? I think letters to the editor are always a good idea. People are most likely to read their local papers. And so anytime you see any opening there, submitting a letter to the editor is a great idea. Someone also asked about talking to members of Congress. Members of Congress hear from the other side all the time. When it comes to Venezuela, they all hear from this Venezuelan diaspora, which is anti-socialist, wealthy, predominantly European in descent and racist, and they're the ones in there saying, "Oh, poor Venezuela." We need to be in there and bring other Venezuelans in to actually tell the truth to our members of Congress and educate them about what's happening. I think it's important now to continue to get the idea out there that the military is really the enforcement arm of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, global capitalism. There's a growing sentiment against that, and people understand it here at home, how poor and Black and brown communities are occupied by law enforcement so that they don't disrupt the rich communities. That's the same thing that we're doing all around the world. We have a strong war culture in the United States. If you look for it, you'll see it. A lot of times we've just been raised in it, so it's like a fish swimming in water. You don't see it until it's pointed out to you that you're in water. We see war culture from the clothing that children wear, the toys they play with, the television, the movies, and it's all around us, the way we, lionize people who are in the military. So we have to confront all of this. And we have to put forward a vision of what we want to see differently. And I think that's where the Green Party is so important, because we have a bilateral war machine, and the Green Party is an anti-war party. We put forward a path to an alternative foreign policy, one that's based on respect for international law, diplomacy instead of conflict, and an eco-socialist world that would actually lift people up around the world. And we're internationalists, so I think that's really important. It's important to build that international solidarity as well. And so I'll stop there and leave time for questions and turn it over to Kevin.
I'll be brief. I just want to make 2 points because I want to get to questions. And it builds on what both Rich and Margaret have said. One is movement of movements. At Popular Resistance, we believe in the way to victory on issues. We've seen this over and over in campaigns that we've run on issues like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and others, is you have to build a movement of movements. We see the fronts of struggle are being economic, racial, and environmental justice, as well as peace and anti-imperialism. And the issues we're talking about today with regard to this hybrid warfare impact economic, racial, and environmental justice. I saw the drug war mentioned a few times in the chat box. I've worked on that issue since 1980, and you can see the militarized police, the mass incarceration, the racist police enforcement, and that mirrors our foreign policy. And I think with this current uprising against police violence, the response of militarized police has brought home that issue. So the environment is so impacted by militarism. Howie Hawkins, who is going to be our next nominee, who won about 58% of the delegates, he is very key on combining the issue of the Green New Deal with focused on militarism, because you cannot confront the climate if you don't confront militarism. If we don't deal with the pollution of the Pentagon and the war machine, we can't confront the climate crisis. And so it's critical to make that link. So movement of movements, I think, is a critical thing. The second thing I want to emphasize is we are the media. Each of us, we have about 55 people on this call. Each of us, if we think of ourselves as the media and have 2 tasks: one, build our networks so we reach more people. And you can do that in a targeted way. On social media, you can target media outlets, you can target opinion makers, you can target elected officials, leaders of organizations. So you can build your network. That's one thing. Second thing, use your ability to spread the word. At Popular Resistance, we publish about 15 articles a day on what's going on in the movement and issues related to the movement. You can get that in a daily digest. Go to popularresistance.org on the front page, or sign up for the daily digest, and you can then get in your email box a summary of 15 articles, a few lines about each. If there are articles that you're interested in, you go to that article and then copy the URL and send it to your network. Spread the word. This makes a difference. We are in a battle for the narrative, and corporate media is having a big challenge with that. Their credibility is down, their viewership is down. People trust people they know better than they trust someone on television. So our ability to communicate is so important. And if we are conscious about overtaking that narrative and dominating that narrative, then we can do it. The 55 people on this call could easily reach 50,000 people a day, probably much more than that. And if we are conscious about building our networks, we can reach even more. So I think those are the key issues I will leave you with. Is we need to reach out, build movement of movements, and we need to reach out and spread the word, because education is the foundation of every movement. The way movements win are by building a national consensus. And that national consensus comes from outreach, the movement of movements, and in controlling the narrative or impacting the narrative. If we can do those 2 things, then we can really make some major changes. I'll stop there and leave it for others to ask questions. Thanks a lot for all being here.
Great, thank you. So we do have some time for questions. If you would like to ask a question, I'm going to ask that it is a question and that you try to keep it brief, since we don't have a lot of time left. You can either just put your name in the chat, or just say, I want to ask a question in the chat, and I'll call on you. Or you can use the raise hand function, and you'll find that if you bring your cursor down to the bottom bar and click on participants, you'll see at the right, when that comes up on the right hand side, there's a little icon of a raised hand that you can raise. And I see that Linda has her hand raised, so why don't you go first?
Yes, I just was wondering what the speakers consider a possible movement of movements, some organization that's on the ground now that could play that role.
Go ahead, Margaret.
You want to respond to that, Kevin?
I was going to let you respond.
Okay, so the movement of movements is a concept. It's not like there's an organization that encompasses all the movements, but it's really about getting movements working together, understanding the connections, and having that common vision, and then working towards that. Sometimes in campaigns, we will purposefully do that. We did that in our fight against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where we really tried to make it, relevant to other different issues and bring them all together. But in general, it's really about changing kind of the public narrative and getting various sectors of different movements understanding the importance of, stopping the war, decreasing the military in order to be successful in what they're doing. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I want to add, on a Popular Resistance website, we have a school, popularresistance.org/school. It's on the top banner of the page. Margaret and I did this school. It's 8 classes, web-based, with lots of reading materials if you want to read the materials as well. And we talk about strategy and tactics for building movements. And the movement of movements idea, Margaret mentioned the TPP, that's a great example. Trans-Pacific Partnership could have been limited just to people who care about trade. But when we broadened it out to include people who care about workers, the environment, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, corporate power, issue after issue. And that created an immense movement that could not be resisted by politicians. Even Hillary Clinton, who was in the administration negotiating the TPP, had to come out against it. Even the Ohio Senator, Portman, who was the former U.S. trade representative for George Bush, came out against the TPP. Donald Trump used the TPP to his advantage in the campaign. And so we created a movement that created national consensus that showed itself, and then had a small percentage of people who were active in showing what that movement wanted. I think that's the perfect, and that was a 6-year campaign.
We have a bunch more questions, Kevin. And
oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I'm going to go next to Chris.
I won't go through all 6 years.
Chris,
thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. So my question is, how do we as a party, two-part, increase our name recognition? Because I think that's critical. People I talk to don't even know we exist. And two, how do we get our platform into the debates and into the public discourse? Because 98% of voters, 1,000% agree with us. They know the Democrats and Republicans are in bed together. How do we do that? Please, everybody, how can we do that? That's my question for everyone.
Let's let Rich go with this one. Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, well, I wish I had a secret answer. I mean, I don't think that there is any substitute for hard work for, and you have to look at this as a long-term project. I know that's very frustrating to people. We want to see results soon. We live in a society that, wants things to happen instantly. But the reality is, I don't see any substitute. Obviously, Green Party campaigns, that's one of the purposes they serve, is even when you're not at a point when you can be that competitive or can actually win, they still help get the word out. They still help raise the consciousness, getting those names on the ballot. All of those things play a role. I mean, if I knew a secret answer to that question, we might be there already. But unfortunately, I don't know of any shortcuts.
I'm sorry, I don't want to step over your words, but there's so much energy between Black Lives and Sunrise Movement that now is the time. So many of us have been in this fight for decades, and it's hitting our head against a wall, and it's preaching to a choir. This is the year we need to put forth a message. We can't wait till 2024 when people know us better. That's my concern. And I'll mute myself for the rest of the call. I'm sorry.
I wanted to just point out that the Green Party does impact the political narrative. Ralph Nader ran on single payer back in 2000, and now we're seeing Medicare for All as a major topic in discussion. Of course, there's been a long-term movement pushing that as well. Howie Hawkins was the first to run on the Green New Deal as a platform. He worked with other Greens who are running for Congress, and Jill Stein, so that was a significant part of the platform, and now we're seeing that come out. So we do have an impact on the narrative, but it is the hard work that we do every day of reaching out to other people in our community, running strong candidates, using social media, wearing our t-shirts and paraphernalia so that people see that there is a Green Party. And I think that, the national party work, there's so much work to do, and we're an all-volunteer basically organization with a few paid staff. People jumping up to help out with creating social media content, taking on some of the tasks, all of that helps us to be more effective.
I'll just say that at the Hawkins campaign, you can sign up on the front page, harryhawkins.us. We're creating a media team of grassroots activists to echo our media, to get our message out. I think, Chris, you're exactly right. This is the time to do it. This is a year of impossibles becoming realities. And so I think we really need to work together to shape the narrative, get our issues out there. And if we do it in a conscious way, as I said before about being the media, we can do that with our campaign as well. That's what we're trying to do with the Hawkins campaign. We already have 1,000 people who signed up to be volunteers. We need people to sign up, and especially sign up to be our echoes in the media. Over.
Next have Paul, and then Chris Richardson and Sheldon. I think that's all we're gonna have time for. So go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, but I think I'm done. Let's somebody else go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes,
Now
now
we
we
hear
do.
you.
All right. So great thing. I just want to bring up that the war situation is not only between national states and everything. There's also war against the people, and I've been fighting against the drug war for years. It's World War III. They've killed probably over 1 million people if you count from Vietnam to Afghanistan to Mexico and Colombia and the other countries. So can we include the drug war in our anti-war activities?
I mentioned when I was commenting, I think you were on the phone when I did it, but I was mentioning when I was commenting that the drug war is an example of bringing the war home. That we see these mass arrests, mass incarceration, militarized police, racist police enforcement. This is bringing the war home. So I think the drug wars are really, and it's an issue that's right now at a very key point. We are making incredible progress. When I started working on the drug war in early 80s, we had about 15% support for marijuana legalization. Now we have 65% for legal adult use, 85% for medical, and the war on drugs is not popular. This is a great time to tie that issue in. So I agree with you. It's an important issue. We should bring it in.
Great. And I'll say real quick. Also, they used the DEA at one time was the biggest intelligence agency, even bigger than the CIA and all the other ones. That may not be true now. It may now be like the third or fourth biggest, but it's still, and it has interfered in other countries' elections and been used as part of intelligence gathering for CIA overthrows.
Yes,
like
that's why I mentioned that the DEA was thrown out of Venezuela and thrown out of Bolivia because they were operating on regime change as their primary function. So yeah, I agree that the DEA.
Well, Evo Morales is claimed.
We have to go to other questioners.
All right.
I'm sorry, and just quickly add that the DEA was involved in the recent mercenary coup attempt in Venezuela. So we have Chris Richardson is next.
Yes. Well, we are in the middle of a biological war right now with COVID-19, and we actually do have complicity in the production of COVID-19. You notice that there were 2 strains that showed up almost identically at the same time, simultaneously in Wuhan and in Syria, Iran, Italy, and Spain. Two different strains of the same virus. One came to the U.S. through Washington. The other came through the East Coast. Now, there's also there was a project called PREDICT by USAID. Are you familiar with that at all? It was a search for most pandemic-worthy pathogens. And Wuhan and a lot of other stations in the country or in the world were targeted. And we went out and found some really nasty pathogens. And then we turned them over to NIH, who had a program called Enhance or Gain in Functionality. Gain in Functionality. This is where we weaponized it. And then we store those at Fort Detrick. And last year, the CDC closed Fort Detrick because the inventory did not match what the pathogens that they had on hand. And that was right before it showed up in Wuhan and in Eastern Europe.
I'm going to put my doctor hat on for a second, if I can, to respond to that. And, you know, it's not unusual for viruses to mutate and for there to be
Oh,
different.
no, I got no problem with that. But the same strain is showing up in all 4 of those locations.
That's
And
not
it's primarily because they want to get off of the petrodollar. And we don't want that.
okay. Well,
And
I'm just going to say that I think that this is a natural occurrence. There's no evidence that it's not a natural occurrence. Until there's that evidence, I don't think we should talk about it that way.
Chris, if you raise issues, you have to listen to the answers. So please silence yourself.
I'm a biologist. I know the answer.
I'll let you answer your own thing.
All right, let's go to the next question.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
That's all the questions that we have for today, and I think we're over time unless anybody else has a question.
Well, yes, I had another one. Why haven't we brought in the Cubans who have helped the Chinese break their outbreak? And then they and the Chinese and went to Spain and Italy and helped them solve.
We haven't brought in the Cubans because they're the enemy for the United States. It's
Of
part
course they are.
of the
Because
hybrid.
we
That's part of the hybrid.
Let's
Okay,
say
I don't
we
want to
love our
argue.
people.
Thank you all very much for coming. I'm going to head out now. I got other things to do. I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you all.
You bet.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks,
Chris.
everyone. Appreciate it.
And
Take
this will
care.
be available as a video. People can go back and watch and share it out there.
Yes.
See you
Good.
this weekend.
Mhm.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Warren Power.
Cheers.